Good evening and good afternoon to our colleagues across the pond. My name is Stacy Johnson, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the third in our series of joint University of Nottingham, University of Connecticut events, Is the University Colonial? Critical conversations on its past, present, and future. When I look to the past, as we did in the first conversation last year, I'm reminded of my lineage, the descendant of a slave, the child of a republic, Trinidad and Tobago, that had not one, not two, not three, but four colonial masters: the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and finally the British. In the present, I am an associate professor in the School of Health Sciences at the University of Nottingham, living in the kingdom, the empire. A woman who, in 2019, journeyed to the very heart of the empire, Buckingham Palace, to be made a member of the British Empire. Stacy Johnson, me, MBE. It was a decision on which I have been challenged on several occasions by people of all ethnic backgrounds. How could you take that title? And I have to say that as I stood, my parents, who had lived under British rule, at my back, and Britain's future King, Charles, at my front, as he pinned that medal to my chest, the past, the colonial past, weighed as heavily on my shoulders as if it were the present. And so, tonight's discussion, the third in our series, Is the University Colonial, which looks to the future. It's not an academic discussion for me. That future is important and deeply personal to me. And so I am very much looking forward to hearing the thoughts of our panel and the questions and comments of you, the audience, as we spend the next hour and a half together. We start with our keynote speaker, Vice Provost Michael Bradford of the University of Connecticut. Over to you, Vice Provost.
Thank you so much for having me in this conversation. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. I want to first thank our colleagues at the University of Nottingham's Institute of Policy and Engagement, and also my colleagues at the University of Connecticut's Office of Global Affairs for helping to put together this particular important conversation and giving me the opportunity to provide a few opening remarks to this absolutely necessary conversation, what we are living, have lived, and will be living, as it concerns how we treat each other as human beings and how to be respectful. So when I sat down to think about this topic, I thought this is a bit different than what I am normally asked to engage in as a playwright. As a matter of fact, some folks might ask, how in the world is a playwright sitting in the office of the Vice Provost? I have asked that on a number of occasions myself. So when I thought about how I might approach this space with so many really smart people, I thought about a joke that I have heard before. I'm sure that many of us have heard this particular joke before, and given our certain or current social and political and environmental issues, it's probably not a joke that's funny anymore, but the joke goes as thus. Two fish are swimming in the vast ocean, two young fish, and they encounter an old fish. And the old fish says, "How's the water?" And they go their respective ways, and the two young fish look at each other and say, "What's water?" I think for many years I focused my amusement on the young fish, but just lately I have started to rethink the presence of the old fish. The old fish knows, as the young fish do not, that the water is not the intrinsic status quo of our existence. I'm sure the old fish knows the young fish are simply unconscious of the water, much the same way we are often unconscious of breathing, unconscious of the makeup and the construct of our environment. So what separates the old fish from the youngsters? The old fish has had experiences and time to move from unconsciousness to consciousness about the nature of his or her environment. Experiences and time to understand the nature of water. Now, if the water is deleterious to one's psychological and physical existence, consciousness might seem to be the first step in addressing and changing that environment. But maybe it is simply the prologue. After all, the old fish is still swimming in the same water. So the answer to the central question of our conversation today, in my humble opinion, is yes. Yes. In the writer and historian Isabel Wilkerson's latest book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontent, she uses the popular movie The Matrix as an analogy to explain the systems of white supremacy that are so deeply embedded in the daily drone of our lives, that it passes so often for life itself. And those who become aware, become conscious, threaten the hum of the matrix. And the matrix is willing to bend here or there, but it is often not willing to break. So now that the main character in the film has become conscious, how does he challenge the water? How does he challenge the matrix? It becomes quickly clear that his new consciousness is not enough to affect change. And I'll quickly add, I don't think the role of the oracle, who the main character consults on the nature of the matrix, was incidentally cast as a Black woman. I'll just leave that at that. I thought about this dynamic of bending but not breaking as I read the book chapter my colleagues Dr. Frank Stewart and Dr. Saran Stewart co-authored. Decolonizing academic space, moving beyond diversity to promote racial equity in post-secondary education. At one point they argue, thus the majority of diversity initiatives being implemented to support the increased diversity of students rarely impact the colonial campus system, end quote. And that well-intentioned diversity initiatives, quote, have not resulted in substantial transformation of day-to-day operations of campus business. The water remains the water. The matrix remains the matrix. And those initiatives instead focus more on how to assimilate minoritized students into the existing campus culture. The matrix is willing to bend, but it is not so willing to break. And if the movement from unconsciousness to consciousness is actually not the pressure point that starts to bend the arc of history towards justice, then what is? I believe Dr. Stewart and Dr. Stewart argue the first step is the inward gaze. I was listening intently to Stacy as she began our conversation here, and I thought about the weight of history weighing upon her as she stood there in that important moment. And I thought about how internally she was looking, even as she knew who was behind her and who was in front of her. In their text, Dr. Stewart and Dr. Stewart include one of the best known quotes of the late Audre Lorde, the great writer, feminist activist. Quote, critical scholar activists spend a great deal of time trying to figure out how we can use the master's tool to dismantle the master's house, also known as the academy. They buttress this notion by arguing that decolonizing one's own mind is actually the first step in dismantling institutional practices and narratives that support the objectives of the status quo, the matrix, so to speak. I felt like I was preaching for a moment there, forgive me. I will remind those of you who've made it through the film and the sequels, the main character returns inside the matrix again and again because creating a disruption in the program is an inside job. The matrix has to be directly engaged if it is to be disrupted. Deconstructing the often invisible structures within the academy cannot be rectified by even the best intentioned diversity initiatives or policies around equity or statements on the value of diversity. We will most certainly have to acknowledge our own colonial gaze, even as we create new tools to dismantle an old house. I suspect that is why we are here today, swimming in these particular waters, challenging this particular matrix, moving beyond our own inward gaze to build a new structure with new tools, where pluralism is a material reality that thrives.
Thank you so much, Vice Provost. I hadn't thought about the matrix in that way at all. You know, if you have a playwright doing the keynote, that's what's going to happen, isn't it? So we're on now to our panelists, and we have two panelists from the University of Connecticut, as well as panelists from across the pond, one from Ireland and one from the University of Nottingham. So the panelists will each have about 8 minutes to give some opening remarks, and then I will be opening up the questions to you, the audience. So get your questions ready as you're listening to our panelists. Get your questions, your comments, your challenges ready. And of course, I've got some questions as well, and I'm sure many, many more will come up as our panelists speak in turn. First, we will be hearing from Dr. Saran Stewart. Saran's comments will be followed by Dr. Glenn Mitoma, who will be followed by Dr. Kathryn Haley, and finally we will hear from Dr. Hannah Robbins. Let me first hand over to Dr. Saran Stewart.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson and Provost Bradford. I appreciate those openings. It's a tough act to follow. And Dr. Johnson, I do have my timer, so I'm going to disclose that there might be 35 seconds over, but let's go. According to the United Nations, by 1945, some 750 million people were under colonial rule, which equated to roughly a third of the global population at the time. Fast forward to 2021, 2 million persons remain under colonial rule, the majority of which reside in my beloved the Caribbean and the South Pacific. I entered this space as a first-generation post-colonial citizen born to colonized parents who currently reside in Jamaica. I am proud to say I was raised, primarily educated, and worked at the University of the West Indies. I say all of this as decoloniality and decolonization are subject to context, the liminalities of regional perspectives, and the intersections of power and oppression from the global North and global South. I recently published a book chapter titled Plantation Pedagogies in Contemporary Higher Education Classroom that is co-edited by one of my co-authored partners, Professor Frank Stewart. So I'm going to read a small excerpt as it will best situate this said context that we're about to enter into. I quote, "Within British American slave societies, there were systems of governance that replicated those in England, such as the appointment of the governor to the crown, his executive committee, the most honorable privy council, the House of Assembly, and so on. Mainly planters of large and small estates occupied government and parliamentary roles within the slave society, essentially forming an oligarchy system in which few possessed most of the wealth and power in society. Ironically, today, we have substituted oligarchy for democracy and traded in the plantation mercantilist economy for capitalism, operating within the same political ideology that centers white supremacy, which is rooted in the minds of both the oppressed and the oppressor. So a post-secondary critique of plantation politics informs an understanding that the systems of higher education, although built by enslaved people and the descendants of the enslaved, were not created with them in mind. So systems of higher education within British America originated from the Oxbridge structure of multiple colleges and faculties of disciplines. Some colonial institutions originated as offshore colleges and universities based in England, such as the University College of the West Indies, now known as the University of the West Indies. These colleges were controlled by their mainland institutions, and the very approval of the course outlines, the syllabus, the administration of examinations, the conferral of degrees were managed by their host institution. In this case, it was the University of London. So oftentimes, these institutions occupying a majority Black populace would be in constant political and ideological struggle for the soul of the university. The fact that some of these very institutions were bequeathed from former estates and plantation owners and established on former plantations provides a modern day historical oxymoron. The very system of institutionalized learning and oppression was created on the lands of slave societies. And although higher education institutions operate today in an era of independence, most function within the principles of plantation politics. These principles I have named as one, the exploitation of Black and brown bodies, labor, identity, and emotions at the expense of the self, but the economic benefit of the university. Two, the institutionalized hierarchy and stratification of race, class, and gender that inform the climate and structures of the power within the institution. Three, policy guidelines and regulations designed for and to reinforce the structure of power and wealth of an institution. And then four, the practice and reward of plantation pedagogy to support the ideological subservience of the plantation. I meant the university, end quote. So in addressing the futurities or possibilities to decolonize higher education, I will use Jamaica and the University of the West Indies as a modern day case study to highlight one of the central tenets to decolonize the university, decolonizing the curriculum. I will also point out the direction of our colleagues Sharon Stein and Vanessa Andriotti's work in Canada, and myself and Professor Frank Tewitt's that was prefaced by our Provost, in which we took on decolonizing academic spaces. Stein and Andriotti produced an article in 2016 titled Decolonizing Higher Education, Decolonization and Higher Education. They note that there's a conundrum about us. There is a constitutive paradox of the colonial construction of knowledge that haunts every effort to decolonize these existing institutions. They summarize three main principles, and I'll only focus on two. One in which is the emphasis on individual and institutional interventions, focusing on the proportional representation to increase the number of Indigenous, racialized, and low-income faculty, staff, and students. To also replace existing curricula with non-Western perspectives. The last of those three comments, which is arguably the hardest, is the dismantling of the larger macro social system that reinforces and values a colonized higher education system. So my colleague, Frank Tewitt, and I, when we produced the academic spaces, we did it from the integrating perspectives of the global South and the global North. And we came up with four ideological frames: decolonizing the mind, decolonizing pedagogy, decolonizing structures, and reimagine the academy from a decolonized lens. For the purposes of this, I will only focus on one, which is the first. We argue for and examine and provide examples for three of the four frames in our chapter, because the last frame remains difficult to imagine without looking to our global South partners and recent countries that are actually became recently independent and have been in the current struggle from independence to decolonization. So the university, very important, especially those that are public, belong to the government or the nation state, can never be fully decolonized until the country, the central organ itself, the large macro system, is unresponsive to the commodification of a global capitalist hierarchy and US imperialism. So at the University of West Indies, for example, decolonizing the mind is seen as decolonizing the curriculum in ways of knowing by establishing units such as the Jamaican language unit, where we have written, published on the vernaculars of our central mother indigenous tongues and patois. We reify Caribbean indigenous and endangered languages from those such as the Arawaks and Tainos that are then written into the national standards curriculum, so that my then fifth grader or grade 5 student was reading, writing, and being assessed in social studies using indigenous linguistics as a standard, not as the exception. Other ways of decolonizing the mind meant that within the university, there was a concerted effort to develop researchers and methodologists to write for and by the Caribbean so that we would put a stop and limit to the importation of foreign ideologies to inform our way of being and self. So to close, I promise, Ms. Dr. Johnson, most of us have learned from Audre Lorde in 1983 that it is difficult to dismantle the master's house with the master's tool, and that Black and Brown faculty were educated to operate as legacies of the oppressor in the academy while being simultaneously oppressed. Frantz Fanon in 1952 echoed similar sentiments in describing what it meant to be Black faces in white masks living as the oppressor within. Arguably, within the US and larger globe, there is a concerted movement by Black and Brown faculty to become critically conscious of that oppressor within and disrupt what Frank Tuitz names in 2019 and argues against as the colonial academic gaze within us, and what Laurie Patton Davis named as a zombification of the academy. So consequently, when education was philosophically understood as fitting for a society, what that essentially meant was that education was expected to create a local citizen for a society structured along the supply chains of the plantation economy. So if we are truly to remove ourselves from these supply chains, we must be willing to demand more for ourselves and our colleagues, to decolonize not only the university and ourselves, but the larger macro systems that reinforce and uphold them. I thank you. Dr. Johnson.
What a start from Dr. Saran Stewart. Thank you so much. Zombification. Yeah, I mean, what amazing. So we've had Matrix to start, now we've got zombies, right? So the future can't be colonial, right? Doesn't sound like a good future. Dystopian future, it sounds like. I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Glenn Mitoma, who will be our next speaker. Over to you, Glenn.
Many thanks, Dr. Johnson. That is a hard act to follow, Dr. Stewart. I'm gonna shift things a little bit. It's exciting to be here. I'm really grateful to everyone for putting it together, and it's a real honor to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues from around the entire Atlantic here. I want to start also by acknowledging that I'm a settler of color working and living on the historic homelands of the Nipmuc, Mohegan, and Pequot peoples. And that as a historian on this panel focused on the future, I'm feeling a little bit out of my element, right? I am out of that water that Michael described in his first his joke. But like Michael, I think I'm saved a little bit because I've been spending a lot of the pandemic reading. The only fiction I'm reading these days is science fiction, right? I'm like, that's the only thing I want to read is like a different world than ours. Although I have been thinking less about the Wachowski brothers in The Matrix than Octavia Butler as a source of inspiration for thinking about this particular dilemma that we're in. Her novels, both about both Kindred as well as Parable of the Sower, give us something of a way, at least for me, to enter this conversation by connecting and understanding a deep understanding of the past to accountability in the present, to a way of envisioning a different future. And so I think, what I want to spend at least my 7 minutes left in this this opening address doing is starting back in my my comfort zone of the past, so that we can get to the future. This is a way of framing history as responding to the present but aim to the future. I think if we're going to confront this question of is the university colonial, we have to first reckon with that past, a careful reckoning that takes into account the precise nature of both the larger structures of higher education, but then the particular histories of individual universities, so that in the present we can be made accountable, right? We can be held to account for exactly that history and use that as a way of beginning to understand the ways that our current structures and practice contribute to a form of neo-colonialism, which I think Dr. Stewart described very aptly, but then finally to find within that opportunities to imagine a different future, to ask really, how can we identify and then foster what will be seeds of a post-colonial future for the university? So that's the kind of trajectory. I'm going to start here in the past, and then hopefully in the question and answer period we can go to the more about the present and the future. So as I said, thinking about the future requires us to grapple with the past. In general, it's clear, I think, again, from what Dr. Stewart presented, that universities were important parts of the colonial enterprise, really the intellectual arm of the expansion of European life worlds. For land-grant universities, of which the University of Connecticut is one, this is meant quite literally. So the University of Connecticut finds its charter rooted in the 1862 Morrill Land Grant Act, which was a legislative action that literally converted land into knowledge through this particular apparatus. It was in the context of the larger westward expansion, right? It passed in 1862. It's the middle of the Civil War. It's part of the way in which Lincoln and after him, the Republicans sought to heal the wounds of the Civil War by projecting colonial expansion to the west, right? So it's the conflict between the North and the South will be solved by conquest of the West. This is particular to the United States, but a general frame for imperialism generally, right? What we know about the rise of imperialism in the late 19th century is that it, in large part, responded to the need to deal with modernizing industrialization and the rise of conflict at home by displacement abroad. So these larger projects are this context, and it's not for nothing to note, right, that Lincoln, the same year that he signed the Morrill Land Grant, also signed the largest mass execution in U.S. history, the execution of 38 Dakota leaders for rebellion, right? Something he never did for any Southern leaders. There were no Confederate mass executions of that nature. So we can see the way in which these two things are knitted together. But specifically with regard to how the Morrill Land Grants worked, it was in two regards, right? One, as I said, the act transferred federal lands to states to be sold to create resources for the founding of state universities, right? These were lands that were federally held. If your state had federal lands, those lands were given to you. But if they weren't given, if you did not have federal lands in your territory, then the federal government would give you scrip, essentially a coupon to be redeemed for land elsewhere in the continental United States to be sold and then redeemed for that land. In the case of Connecticut, which had no federal lands, those scrip were issued for and eventually redeemed for about 180,000 acres of land, stretching across the upper Midwest, the Midwest. There was a few parcels in Florida as well as out in California. This land, originally, the 180 acres totaled about $13,000 was in compensation to the native peoples, but netted for the University of Connecticut a total of 135,000, so almost over 10 times as much. And to give you a sense of where this land came from, California, there were about 5,000 acres that were redeemed for Connecticut sold scrip. It raised about $4,000 for the University of Connecticut in the 1860s, for which the native people received zero compensation. That's because these native peoples of California, and particularly the Yuki Indians, were subject to a campaign of mass extermination, right? Genocide by every definition during the 1840s, which allowed for the seizure of the land, its alienation, and then reselling to benefit the University of Connecticut. So that transfer of wealth, right? Very, very clear. Secondly, this aided in the overall project of colonialism by moving that land into private hands, right? So the scrip made its way into individual purchasers who then redeemed it and used it. And I'll say the largest amount of land that was redeemed was in the state of Michigan. The homelands of the Chippewa and Ottawa bands of the Anishinaabe peoples. seeded in 1836. And one person, Thomas Mason, bought 80,000 acres worth of it. He paid about $83,000 that went to Yukon, and that was about $10,000 purchased from the Chippewa and Ottawa peoples. So, you know, in this way, right, this whole process expands the map of colonialism. It should also be noted that the type of institutions established under the Morel Land Grant were particularly aimed at more efficient exploitation of territories. The act called for the establishment of higher education institutions focused on agriculture and the mechanic arts, which is to say engineering and industry. So the kinds of agricultural curriculum that flourished at the University of Connecticut and the rest of the land grant colleges allowed for a scientific approach to agriculture, which really for much of its history amounted to a form of agriculture as extraction. Right, treating the land as a resource to be exploited and the crops to drain the nutrients in order to be transferred or to be monetized as capital. I'll also note, right, that within the mechanic arts space, you know, what Mason was up to in purchasing all of that land in Michigan was in order to become the largest copper industry in North America. He established in the Upper Peninsula the Quincy Mining Company on land purchased through this land grant, which turned out to be the largest copper mine in the United States for the better part of the 19th century, feeding the larger infrastructure of global capitalism that again, Dr. Stewart refers to as the supply lines and supply chains by which the larger economy is constructed. So, I'm gonna end here because I know we've got to move on to the next speakers. But I want to say that ultimately, right, these processes and establishments hold today as the patterns by which the colonial university continues to operate, and that any process that is going to move us forward to a decolonizing present and hopefully a post-colonial future must include a close, careful, restorative, and reparative address to the specific culpability of each and every one of our institutions in the colonial enterprise beginning in the 19th century. So with that, I'll
Thank you, Dr. Glenn Mitoma, talking to us about the past, the importance of the past in shaping the future, really coming through very clearly there. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Kathryn Haley, who is going to talk to us about a very specific application of this idea of decolonizing in a very specific field where she practices. Kathryn, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. So I am honored to be here and grateful for the opportunity to engage in this conversation with my colleagues and all of the attendees today. So to give you just a brief bit of background, I am a second-year graduate entry medical student at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, based in Dublin. Although I did grow up in Boston and then completed my doctorate degree in the UK, so I have witnessed the withstanding colonial structures in academia on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think in focusing specifically on the future of decolonizing the university in this session, we are here to ask the question, how do we contribute meaningfully to an anti-racist and anti-colonial agenda? So I was asked to join this panel as a result of a student engagement and partnership project that I had proposed with the aim of increasing representation of clinical presentations on dark skin tones in the medical curriculum. So this is perhaps somewhat of a case study for what a small part of the future of decolonizing university might look like. I think it's important to acknowledge that obviously I am white and I have no lived experience of racism, and my efforts in this area have been largely informed by the voices of my Black, Asian, minority ethnic peers, and that these efforts are strictly in the capacity as an ally. So I will say I certainly don't have the same level of expertise as my co-panelists today, but hopefully I can speak to the student perspective and perhaps comment on the ongoing conversations between my peers and I with respect to the future of decolonizing the university, and also highlight some obstacles that we have encountered thus far. So I think in a university setting, we often fail to regularly acknowledge that the foundations of our knowledge systems were largely created 500 years ago by white male scientists in Europe, and that these knowledge structures are not always appropriate for or representative of modern day learning needs, that need to occur. So if we think of decolonization in academia in the context of an active will to community, then we need to invert the hegemony that exists as a result of colonization and return the power structures to the hands of marginalized students or the collective learning community. So I think RCSI offers a strong example of this practice by putting out a call for student-led projects which aim to better learning or the foundations of the university as a whole in any capacity. So this not only enables representation of student voices in university power structures, but it also ensures that change is led and affected directly by students. So the project that I proposed as part of the Student Engagement and Partnership Initiative was designed to increase representation of dermatological presentations on Black and brown skin tones in the curriculum. And the proposal was largely motivated by conversations with my peers about the lack of representation in the clinical images that are shown to us in lectures. So 95% of these images, realistically, probably 99% of these images are shown on white skin tones. And given that clinical presentations can look vastly different on dark skin tones, my classmates and I felt that it was important to be seeing representation of clinical presentations on both Black and white skin tones in the lecture setting. So just to give a brief example, if a patient is hypoxic or has a low level of oxygen in their blood, we are taught that the skin or their lips will look blue. And this is a hallmark of clinical diagnosis. Again, if a patient is jaundiced, we are taught that their skin will look slightly yellow, but we have no frame of reference for how this might present or what this would look like in Black, Asian, or minority ethnic skin tones. So not only is this not reflective of a very diverse student body at RCSI, but I think it also threatens to directly impact the quality of care provided for our BAME patients in the future. So to increase representation of clinical presentations on dark skin tones in the curriculum, I proposed 3 project outputs. First, to generate lecture slides which directly show clinical presentations on both Black and white skin tones to be directly incorporated into lectures. Secondly, to develop a 5 to 10 minute tutorial for all lecturers on the importance of increasing representation in lectures and the current resources available to do so. And then finally, generation of both student and staff surveys to be administered both pre and post implementation of the project in order to measure any impact. So I think in any decolonization efforts, it's important to emphasize that the task is so mammoth that we need to be vigilant about adopting existing resources where they are available and not reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So to that end, when I started searching for images of clinical presentations on dark skin tones to include in these lecture slides, I actually discovered that Malone McQuende, a Black medical student at St. George's University in the UK, had started a project called Mind the Gap and had already developed a handbook with images of clinical presentations on dark skin tones. So I emailed him to say, would it be possible to reproduce these images in lecture slides for this project? And he kindly obliged. And I think this further emphasizes the importance of a collective learning community, not just within one university, but globally as we engage in decolonization efforts in academia. So another recurring theme that we've encountered in the Race Equality Forum at RCSI has been how to ensure that decolonization efforts are not tokenistic, but are sustainable and will affect lasting change. And I think this is where it's especially important to encourage the university to adopt a collective understanding that decolonization efforts should be informed by a learning collective consisting of those who have been marginalized and oppressed. I think the irony of the system is that continued education is the path towards our evolution into a post-colonial structure. And it always seems somewhat ironic to me that in academic institutions that are committed to the acquisition and development of knowledge, the very process of learning, specifically learning from students and from each other, is undeniably the way forward with respect to decolonization. So to that end, I wanted to emphasize the importance of staff training in this Represent project in the hopes that any changes affected within the current student body will endure beyond the tenure of this class. So thirdly, although decolonization entails a systemic attitude and culture shift at the university level, which may be immeasurable to some degree, my peers and I in the RCSI Race Equality Forum have also raised concern about measuring progress towards these efforts. So within the scope of this small project, I plan to measure student satisfaction with the degree of representation in the curriculum, pre and post implementation of the pilot, as well as staff confidence and knowledge in addressing dermatological presentations on dark skin tones with the hope that any changes might be reflected. So I guess taking a step back, this is a very small effort towards decolonizing the university, but I think that some important themes are reflected in this case study. So first would be an emphasis on the difference between representation and diversification, which Professor Cecile Wright actually commented on in the first session. I strongly agree with her that it's important to acknowledge that diversification can entail hiring white women into high positions in academic power structures, and that is not the same as representation, which is central to decolonization efforts. And then finally, through my work on the project and involvement with the RCSI Race Equality Forum, another recurring theme has been the importance of differentiating between decolonization, which consists of deconstructing long-standing colonial power and knowledge structures, versus diversification, which reflects the introduction of diversity alongside existing knowledge structures in academia. So here, I think it is especially important in our efforts towards decolonizing the university to consistently label it accurately and to call it what it is, because that forces us to acknowledge the injustices of the past and our role in actively perpetuating them.
Thank you, Dr. Haley. And finally, we go over to Dr. Hannah Robbins from the University of Nottingham. Hannah, over to you.
Is the university colonial? In a word, yes. But how? And what can we do about it? I am going to talk about new tools and status quos. I am sitting with what was, what is, and what we can create. How can I, the daughter of a Rastafarian traveller, a biracial or mixed black man who is literally rootless, exist in spaces where people like my father are not represented in a single book in my institution's library, while my colleagues ask why I am always talking about race? No, I am a music scholar who works on the applications of Black feminism and critical race scholarship in musical theatre. It's literally my work. There is something to say also about the fact that our decolonial agendas at the moment assume that all non-white people are also experts on race and racism and are also anti-racist activists. And that is something that we have to grapple with in imagining a decolonial future, that at the moment these conversations center labor exclusively on people who were not originally complicit in the structures we are engaging in. The university is a very big place. And for me, this conversation gets into the first stumbling block when we are arguing for the change of structures, knowledge generation, or exchange. I sit in a relatively unusual place as a relatively new scholar. I'm only 3 years out of my PhD, but I also hold a program management space at the University of Nottingham. Meanwhile, I work in two emerging fields. So I work in musical theatre studies, which is relatively new to the field of music more broadly, but also in Black studies, which has a very long and rich history outside the university in Britain, but we are still dealing with exceptional representation in the UK academy. I feel that some part of the reconciliation of the equalities issues and the road to decolonized research, teaching, and personal practice, which is an important part, must come in a balance of looking back and imagining new. So, as a rule of thumb, our systems of knowledge are built currently like a pyramid. As a new thinker, you have to survey all the things that others think the bricks are made of before you join a row or attempt to stand on top. The problem here is that the seminal, in quotes, or the foundational, also in quotes, are always determined by past thinkers, but also by measures of mass acceptance. However, this can cut against our aims to improve representation, access, attainment, breadth of knowledge, structures that are untainted by violence against different communities, where the decision makers come from the same heritages, educational backgrounds, and like all of us carry certain societal biases, we can never truly move forwards. My time supporting the work of the Free Black University, which is a radical, non-affiliated consortium of scholars and activists, has taught me that we have to be willing to study what exists, while also being willing to abandon what we know if it is not fit for purpose. To give you a practical example, when I teach a course on critical race theory and music on the stage, I start by giving often a predominantly white British cohort, a conversation about the evolution of language, including what constitutes hate speech and the reclamation of terminology and what that can mean for communities. Why? This is a course about musicals. We study Aladdin and The Lion King. Why do we start in this place? Because the university assumes universal standards of language and critical thinking, but is seldom willing to address a construct through its most basic terms. As an academic of mixed Black heritage, I have no illusions about the invisible racism and colonial thought that is entrenched in our knowledge systems. So when my class arrives, I know that many people of all backgrounds will have arrived as spectators, seeing race as something that describes other people's identities and not them. And it is my job to talk about our responsibilities as participants in learning and as critical thinkers before we can look at subject matter and case studies. The myth of objectivity in the arts and humanities and in social sciences really is often a mask for supporting the status quo and suggesting that there is a right way. Yet the best university educations enable creativity and innovation and new ways of looking at things we thought we understood. In order to throw off the colonial lenses we've heard outlined in various speakers' talks before, we have to look at how we have gained our knowledge, who is absent from the conversation, and why. Sometimes it feels convenient to blame identity characteristics as excuses for absence, but that masks the underlying concerns we would rather not discuss. Again, I exemplify this in my classes by talking about the difference between the work on the musical Hamilton and the Disney animation The Lion King. With Hamilton, there is a lot of progress to be made, but we see scholars in history, politics, theatre, music, costume design, geography present in these conversations. The dialogue is still predominantly white, but there are BIPOC voices present and we are loud. But we are also at risk, with several of us reporting death threats and exclusions from professional associations for calling out the colonial politics at play. That said, around The Lion King, we see research about the white American director of the stage musical and about the white European composers of the songs. We seldom see first Black authored writing on any aspect of the film, or in fact, any research about the contribution of African American and Black African composers in the development of the film. We don't have any musical analysis of Lee Bowen's contributions to the scores, to the point that many people forget that it is his voice that opens the film in that iconic sequence around the circle of life. The foregrounding speaks volumes to who is around and who is allowed to be interested. To my mind, this is what our institutions can change in the short-term future, to allow everyone permission to be present and interested, to take responsibility for our words as writers, teachers, and learners, regardless of our standpoint. And finally, to recognize that this conversation won't end till due action has been taken. And even if you meet resistance, the demand for better, safer, inclusive education continues. And regardless of your standing point of view, it is our jobs as critical and analytical people to engage in why and how we are positioned as individuals in the context of this demand.
Many thanks, Dr. Hannah Robbins, and thank you to all of the panelists who've started us off really beautifully, really stimulating some big ideas. You know, I think one of the things that is drawn together by all of the speakers, I think, actually comes from the words of Dr. Saran, Stewart's countryman, my favorite Bob Marley: emancipate yourself from mental slavery. This notion of marginalized knowledges, hegemony, and in fact the imposition of alien knowledges onto populations seems to sort of be a common thread throughout all of the talks. I want to remind our audience, we've got about 90 people on the call today. Do please post your questions, your comments. We don't mind a bit of controversy, so if you want to post a challenge to any of the speakers, be my guest. I'm going to first go to some of the audience questions, just to you know, to draw in some of our audience members. So we have a commendation to the Provost about his matrix analogy. And in fact, so I watch the Matrix, but I don't understand the intricacies, so I'm not really sure I understand the question, right? But I will read it out, okay? So our guest says, so really interesting, accessible use of the Matrix from the Provost. Thank you. What should we change in this established matrix? What challenges us in making those changes? What would we be wishing for? Is it just equality? If we were able to develop our own matrix, what do we and our differing perspectives most value? So there's loads of questions in there, really, but what would this imagined matrix look like?
Well, that's a really big question, and I don't know that I'm smart enough to leap into the future to know exactly what it should look like, but it's a fantastic question. I will say, in my humble opinion, that we are looking for a system that is pluralistic. We are not looking for, as Malcolm X would say, we're not looking for the melting pot. We're looking for a pot. We're looking for a Caesar salad. We're looking for the taste of all of our experiences to be established and to be respected and to be tasted, all at one time. And so when we are asking students, faculty, staff to join us in a particular space, and we have not questioned that space, we are just looking at the aesthetic from the outside, looking in at the aesthetic of that space, and we're feeling very good about ourselves because maybe we have changed the ethnic makeup of that particular space. We've only asked people to assimilate. Right, and we have not expected or respected the experiences that they're bringing and the culture that they're bringing into that space. For instance, in the theater, as department head, to challenge my faculty about the need to make sure that William Shakespeare, right, is the be all the end all in the rehearsal process, negates the experience of the Latinx folks who are coming into the program, of African Americans coming into the program, of our Asian and Asian American, students coming in to the program. And so it is not to say we need to negate William Shakespeare, but we do need to say that William Shakespeare rests side by side with these other giants throughout history. And so what we want is to make sure that we have become more pluralistic. I will leave it at that. And in the Matrix, I think that that's what they want. They want consciousness from everybody in the Matrix. For those of you who have not spent a lot of time with the movie, I've spent probably too much. But we need the first step in that particular system, which is consciousness, right? From unconsciousness to consciousness. We need those small fish, those young fish to say, oh, yeah, hadn't thought about the water in a while, but let's chat about it. That's what we need to happen.
Absolutely, and of course, from the global south, the voice of Paulo Freire, where he says, first bring the oppressed to consciousness, wake them up. So that might be part of the work that we need to do. Now, panelists, I was going to ask rather naively, how can the higher education sector, the university sector, successfully lead the way to decolonization of the curriculum? I was going to ask that rather naive question now, thinking back to some of the things that Saran spoke about, but also I'm reminded by Meg Malberg, one of our participants, who's asked a question that perhaps sheds even further light on how naive that question was, perhaps. So Meg asks, describe how we can move away from, and she uses a very specific example of accreditation, so that a new rubric of studies can be developed. You can see my problem with my original question. If we are to lead the way, yet our systems, as Saran was saying earlier, are so entrenched in government control, the empire, and so on, can we lead the way? So can higher education actually lead this decolonization project if we actually are, I suppose, shackled by some of these, and Saran talked about the commodification, for example, of higher education. Is it our job? Can we do it?
This question of leading is probably an important one to start with. And I would say we need to begin actually not as leaders, but as co-learners, right? This was something that Hannah emphasized. I think when in my framing, thinking about the future requires us to create spaces of innovation and change. Like I like The Matrix too, but like I actually have a real problem with that film as a model of change, right? And again, it's been adopted by the right wingers around the world. This idea that somehow you alone can see through the veil that hides the reality of the world from everyone else, and that if you have the kind of superior intellect to pierce that veil, see through it, you will gain superhuman powers to challenge that authority and begin to liberate all. I think that's a hero mythology that's not particularly helpful. And so we need to begin from a place of humility, actually, about what we know as inhabitants of the university, and begin to think about those spaces in which we can co-create knowledge in a different manner that not only responds to the needs of community in a realistic, but is actually of, by, and for those communities. So, you know, specifically with regard to accreditation, I think there are all kinds of structures. Well, you know, I used the language of accountability before, but this is like the bureaucratic structures of accountability that are actually the problem. So whether that's accreditation, I think one of the kind of most neo-colonial structures we have is the idea of ranking, right? The university rankings and the way in which all of us are put on a treadmill to maintain those as individual faculty. If you're not pumping out the widgets of peer-reviewed journal articles to maintain that ranking, then somehow you're failing in your responsibility. I think all of those things need to be reviewed as not leadership in transforming, but simply clearing the kind of iron cage that prevents actual real leadership from the grassroots from emerging, thriving, and then allowing us to follow them.
Thank you, thank you, Hannah. What do you think? Is it like asking the slave master to free the, do you know what I mean, the slaves? So is it going to be us doing it, or does it need to happen from outside?
Both, in my opinion. Like, it's very easy to absent ourselves from labor for the sake of dialogues about sort of hierarchical influence, and ultimately a decolonial future involves everyone on some level, and we have to accept that truth in order to move forward. I think in terms of accreditation, I think the absence of voices is indicative of the fact that the accreditation system on a basic level is broken, and it fosters exceptionalism, which is by definition exclusive. So I think that is the first thing that we have to sort of think about. So how do we move forward? Well, superficial examples are like thinking about who your events are for. Like, if you want to talk about changing who is present, then you have to be able to engage with different people and accept that communicating in those spaces is not better or worse. It's not about simple language and elevated language. That's not what it's about. If you can't communicate something appropriately, then you can't communicate something appropriately. And the problem we have in the academic sort of bubble, as just how I kind of look at it, is this idea of hierarchies of communication, and that who something is for matters in terms of its value to our development. So in terms of sort of what do we do about accreditation? How do we help people develop in communicating? We have to think about what we understand as communication. We have to go back, and the problem is that this is a branch and root question. It's not a shall we change some books on our syllabus or hire a person of color and everything will be better? Like, absolutely not. And if that's where you're at, then you need to do some reading. Like, it's like, to be blunt about it, it's all encompassing, and it means going back to even the language of how we describe the bass line in a song that's written by a blues musician from a Black background versus how we talk about how Elvis sings his songs. It is as basic as that, but that isn't basic. And I think that that's one of the frightening things, I suppose, is that it's not how do we hire people, it's not what books do we buy, it's what does every word I've been using mean, and why am I using it? And obviously I'm generalizing here, but I think that it's very fashionable at the moment to decolonize the curriculum, and it's even more fashionable to attempt to decolonize the curriculum without doing the work and without involving the people who have the expertise, because that's hard. And in terms of, you know, going back to this idea of accreditation, I think we have to understand that we have to look at accreditation differently. We have to see it as a piece of paper someone gets for writing a lot of words about something they know a lot about. But that doesn't make them the only person that knows something about it. This language of exceptionalism, I'm the only person that knows everything about this, is never going to be true. And so if we can move away from this constructed truth that the university likes, that the expert is the only one with authority, then we can start addressing the issues around accreditation. It's a waffly answer, but hopefully it speaks to some of the issues.
No, it makes absolute sense. And, you know, we talk about voices, okay? So, look, we've got a quite diverse panel in terms of ethnic background. We've got a diversity of discipline here. So we've got medicine, we've got history, we've got, you know, a great range. What do you think? I mean, we are still an American university and a British university, and an Irish university. But what do you think a scholar from the South would say? What do you think somebody from the global South would say? It'd be great if there's anybody on the call today, physically now in the global South, or who studied in the global South, post a question or a comment. But so Saran, what do you think? Would the discourse be different if we had two other people who were from out with the United States? I know you have just come from the University of the West Indies, but you beautifully talked about how it started off as a colonial university, a university college, right? What would the rest of the world be saying about this?
Absolutely. I think having the global South, and I can't speak on behalf of them, I can speak on behalf of my experiences throughout the 36 million Caribbean persons that we interact with, right? As the University of the West Indies, having presence within about 22 countries, 4 physical spaces. So there's a couple of things. One is the accreditation process that was just spoken about. I sat on the accreditation committee actually for our campus. And I'm saying that because of how we can shift our lenses is a perfect point. The point of ourselves accrediting us, meaning the University Council of Jamaica, meant that we were no longer responsible to our British colonial rule. It was actually a process, a furthering of our process of independence for us to be able to accredit our own institutions. So I want to name that because in many ways, the lingua franca of English is perceived as very offensive and oppressive. However, if you talk to my colleagues in South Africa, currently within the movement of the 26 universities to decolonize the curriculum after the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movement, English was prefaced as one of the de facto language from that movement. So I say that because you are right in indicating that the global South must come to the table. Otherwise, we're just recentering whiteness and colonialism. So with regards to how to change accreditation, if I wasn't a part of the process, I would have a hard time letting you know that it wasn't as terrible. Let me explain why though. I was worried when I saw some of the names of the accreditors coming from abroad. And then I saw some of our brothers and sisters from about 4 other of our countries that were celebrating the work that we have been doing. The other thing that we were able to do was to co-construct the standards and indicators that were judging us from a very culturally, contextually, country-based perspective, which would be different if it were in Barbados or at the St. Augustine campus. And so it is very critical that accreditation is a marker, but based on which vantage point and lens in which we look at, how do we change the narrative and the marker to be representative? Because the reality is we are accredited for neocolonialism and capitalism movements. We are not recognized, and I say we in a larger sense, as a viable entity until we are ranked, right? And the recognition is also allotted with funding. So I've always claimed, and my colleagues know because I study higher education on a global system, is that Caribbean universities, there are over 200 of them. 43 exist in Jamaica alone with the majority. We are in a crisis, an identity crisis, because of our post-colonial systems that are still in place to the UK and or proximity to the United States imperialism. So if you want to attract US students to come in and spend US dollars, we are then locked into a capitalistic frame. So I think the questions that we really need to ask, because I want to say this in that we've also produced, for the good and bad of it, right, Stacy, about 90% of the prime ministers across the Caribbean, okay? That's no small feat. That is a huge feat when it comes to an institution being able to do that. And I say that because we do have an influence on the societies. We are a microcosm of it. Or doctors are creating the COVID vaccines for a region because currently what is created cannot work sustainably within hotter climates. So it's just not feasible. So we have to have physicians within our region creating vaccines for our people. So I say all of this because I think there is a chance and opportunity, but when capitalism rears its ugly head as an invisible neoliberalist hand, almost like the economic invisible hands, right, of Adam Smith, it is very hard to know who your enemy really is and how do you attack that. So.
Thank you, Saran. We got another question from the audience, which I love, and I'm actually going to come to Kathryn on this one. So this somebody says, this is all very fascinating. I feel like a very small fish, to stick with the joke meta for this person. And they want to know, what can those with limited power within universities, example, more casual staff and younger staff, can do to make and sustain change? And the reason I want to come to you, Kathryn, is because you identify, you've come from Boston, you're a postdoc, but you're a student. You've gone back to the land of studentness, right? And so I guess I want to come to you first to kind of say, well, you've given also almost a case study answer to that question, which is, what can the people with supposedly the least power do? And I'm going to go also to the Provost on this one, the big kahuna on the call, the big fish on the call, right? So I want to first hear from you, Kathryn. What do you think people with least power, ostensibly least power, can do?
Absolutely. I think actually it's a bit off the road from my current project, but just inviting conversations among peers, among students, and maybe in a more formal setting, approaching someone higher up at the university and saying, let's set up a forum or a place where we can have these conversations. Even I think it can seem like such a big, overwhelming task that it's kind of like, where do we start? What do we do? But I think, again, if we return to the idea of kind of a learning collective and listening to our students and learning from each other and having them inform the path forward, then that's a fairly simple step forward, is just starting a conversation. And I think we have done that at RCSI. We just started a race equality forum, which consists of staff and students and people across the entire university. And it is just kind of a conversation and beginning to form the ideas of how do we affect sustainable change and what direction do we take this in.
And what sort of responses did you get as a student, a medical student, when you approached your course leaders, the university, to talk about this? And I don't know if you've had conversations with the student from St. George's, who I know is a young Black man, I believe. Mm-hmm. What kinds of responses have you, both you and him, perhaps got when you first approached course leaders to say this work needs to be done? Were you rebuffed? Was it welcome? What kind of response did you get?
It was actually surprisingly welcome. So I wasn't really sure what sort of response we would get. And I think that was my concern as well, in terms of trying to have staff participate in a brief tutorial and surveying kind of their knowledge and understanding and confidence both before and after the tutorial. I think there might be some apprehension if you have some older lecturers who have just been stuck in their ways for such a long time, to kind of invite that idea of, oh, maybe I need to change. This is the direction we're going in. But yeah, it has been overwhelmingly positive. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to speak directly with Malone yet from Mind the Gap, but I would hope to in the future. Because I think as well, it's kind of a cross-institution thing. So if this model exists somewhere else and we can all start adopting the same model, then hopefully, if we know that model is successful in one setting, it will replicate itself and be successful in another setting.
Great. So hopefully some encouragement there for younger staff, junior staff, or any member of staff who feels they haven't got the power or the voice. And if I could come to you, Vice Provost, What do you think? So what would you say to some of the early career staff that might be on the call? This question specifically references younger staff, casual staff who perhaps don't even have a permanent contract. What would you say they can do? They feel they have no power.
Well, I think most of my colleagues around the academy, want to do the right thing, want to be aware of shortcomings, want to be in conversations about the ways that they can support, we can support each other. And I think I will just piggyback on Dr. Haley's comment that it is really about voicing those concerns. And sometimes when junior staff or staff who is new in the institution are intimidated, it's really a collection of voices. We know throughout history that it is the collection of voices really that causes the impact. There may be someone at the head of that group that lands in the paper or on the television, but it is the collection of voices, that really moves the needle and makes the conversation happen. I will say in my position, 2 or 3 people, or one person can call and I will get to step in, because it's just really important, that we support each other. And at the end of the day, our students, quite honestly, because it all filters down there. We don't really exist for a particular purpose if we're not dealing with our students. And so I would say voice, and at that level, I would say the collective voice is hugely important.
Wonderful, thank you. So I invited provocations from the audience, and they are giving us provocations. And I'd be very interested to hear what our American cousins think about this next question. Okay, and in fact, just the idea. And one of the reasons I'm bringing it, because actually I referenced it in when I was introducing the evening. So somebody says in 2021, after a year of Black Lives Matters and slaver statues being pulled down, should a white vice chancellor be accepting tokens of the British Empire as the UN Vice Chancellor has this year? When do we finally decide that this tradition is no longer acceptable? I know if Vice Chancellor West were here, she'd be inviting the provocation, and this is I'm really interested to hear what the panel thinks, and particularly our American colleagues, because when I talked about standing in front, the thing I didn't say as well is I'm standing in front of Prince Charles, and I had been agonizing for months. And this is not a light thing, because of course the protocol was I should curtsy, bow. I'm a Republican, not in the American sense, right? I am the child of a republic. And that was like a big thing for me. I'm standing there, I'm thinking I am representing my university, my parents. I tell you, I'm pretty sure, we made eye contact. I'm pretty sure he glared at me when I did not curtsy. But, what do you make of all of this? The member of the British Empire, was it? I think Order of the British Empire. What do our American cousins think about this whole honor system in a time when we're saying decolonize the university, deconstruct the hegemonic processes of empire? What do you think?
So I'll take the provocation as the American cousin, and come back to and actually add on to that, right? So the Audre Lorde was invoked a couple of times. I've actually never understood that quote. I don't like, as anybody who's put together or taken apart an IKEA bookshelf should know, the best tools for dismantling the master's house have to be the master's tools. And so, if we're serious about decolonizing as a project, it requires an intimate familiarity with colonialism, full stop. And that involves becoming, a part of the systems and structures and understanding those power dynamics. Now, the addendum to that is, of course, to construct something different from the master's house requires different tools. And so there has to be a simultaneity to our project. On the one hand, mastery of those tools of oppression, so that we can unscrew that stupid screw that only has this weird octagonal shaped head that, you need that darn piece that IKEA gave you. At the same time, you're exploring in concert with others who have been excluded and marginalized with the ways of constructing an alternative future. I think we have to learn to do those at the same time. And so sometimes it means getting pinned by the prince, but not curtsying, right? So
Right.
those options and those to distort, to shift the basis. And it's not, there's no pat answer, there's no recipe. I think we all want to feel comfortable, like, well, we'll never compromise, and I'm clean, I'm not culpable, I'm not a part of the system of oppression. Well, get over it. If you're going to work for a university, you're going to be culpable in this. So how can you negotiate that culpability in a responsible way? Is an ongoing conversation to be had.
I think, I mean, I wouldn't be here if I weren't in some way complicit in this system. I watched how different people were privileged. I mean, it's one thing that I love about social media is how it reconnects people who would never have crossed paths again. And what has happened in the last, 2-3 years of my life is I've reconnected with people I was at school with, because we've ended up in places that have meant our paths have crossed. And one of the things that has come out of that is a fascinating conversation about how my school, as opposed to my university, promoted certain students over other students and put us in particular places, in particular circumstances. Some of us didn't even know about certain gifted and talented schemes, even though we were getting the same grades, those kind of conversations. And the reason that I bring that up is because I sort of think about all the privileges that I had growing up in London, where it didn't matter if you were what my dad occasionally refers to as poor and ethnic, because there was stuff there. And people were willing to give you free theatre tickets and to use, people for photos and that kind of thing. So you ended up getting access to cultural institutions and libraries and resources that people in other parts of the UK didn't have. And therefore I was able to go on a particular journey in terms of my educative development. And that is part of the reason that I've ended up where I am with my PhD. And I really grapple with this question about, speaking in the language of the institution, of the colonizer. Am I centering white? My example from my teaching, am I centering whiteness by explaining all of these concepts? But at the same time, if I don't explain these concepts, I'm more likely to create harmful environments for my students of colour who are dealing with ignorance. Often it's not often willful harm, it's often someone saying something they've heard in a domestic environment and not actually understood what it means. And part of taking responsibility is giving people knowledge. So I think it's really complicated in terms of where do we draw the line between engaging with the institution and walking away from it. And, I recognize the significance of, being one of, I think it's less than 20 people of Black heritage in the field of music in the whole of the UK. And that's significant. And it means that I talk about things differently. But at the same time, I'm publishing in an Oxford handbook that costs, over £100 that no one's ever going to buy. They're not. So who is that work for? And I think the tensions about this conversation about the honours sit in that same space. Sure, I'm advocating, sure, I'm doing all this stuff outside of my professional context, in my activism that people like to describe it as, which I don't think is really an appropriate term, but I'm still there, taking that money. So complicated, but I do think that we can't pretend we aren't where we are. That's the really difficult bit of this conversation, is we want to be 50 years in the future, but we're not. So we have to deal with who we are and where we are now as part of that. And that is why I think that it's not as straightforward as saying you shouldn't have done that, or I shouldn't be teaching where I teach, for example. It's not as straightforward as that.
Thank you. So who should be doing the work? So another question we have from the audience. Often people of color and other minorities are the ones driving the moving away from the standard, accreditation, whether it's broader conversations about decolonization, but accreditation is referenced here, to more imaginative ways to practice academy. That also affects their chances to access positions within the academy. How do we negotiate, change, get out of that loop? Can I come to you, Saran, on that one? How do we get out of this loop? Who's doing the work? Who should be doing the work?
Yeah, that's a really great question, depending on where you are. Absolutely. So I think to try to answer that question, it takes all of us. As I was, I think I've been very adamant about just the dynamics of the conversation in terms of it takes the policymakers, it takes the government officials, to be quite honest with you, and it takes the higher education leaders, right? Provost Bradford representing that in this space. It also takes the students. It takes the custodial staff members, because the impact of decolonizing university system impacts everyone throughout. And so if we're truly being authentic in this process, then absolutely it involves everyone. No, that is what we desire. That is the futurities that we hope for. The current practice, let's just face it, is on BIPOC persons and or allies that have done the self-work to understand the space in which they occupy, right? And so there's a couple of things where at least 40 years ago, I would not be in this space at UConn. This is intentional. I'm one of 4 Black women in my entire college. This is intentionality, and we're still not moving the needle fast enough. I left a campus of over 700, right? Majority Afro-Caribbean across. And I say this because there's 2 things I focus with on my students in particular about change, because they often get exhausted. Some are on this actual call making great questions. I'm so happy to see them. But they often get weighted down by the either or and not the both and, right? And I think Glenn named that we do need pieces of these tools comprehensively to do this work, and multiple players. The other piece is generational. I'm a first generational independent person. My father received the Order of Distinction in Jamaica, and he refused to go to the to the event, but he received it for activism. He received it for changing the civil engineering dynamics within the country. He received it for football. Globally, folks, football, not American football, football, right? And his process of bringing youth who would be normally in gangs off the streets, right? So it's also, what are you being acknowledged for? Because if you're going to win a Nobel laureate, what is the work that dictates that? Not who is presenting. No, who is sometimes political, absolutely. But what is the work that you're earning for that? And that should be celebrated. So I say all this because I think the work is incumbent on us, and those who desire on this path are purposed in our path, because it does not pay. I think Hannah said it best. It is oftentimes traumatizing, both to our professional careers and physically to us. But those who would like to desire for us to be silenced, I'll be honest about this. This work is not for the faint of heart, but we will continue to strive in this work, because I believe wholeheartedly it must be purposefully driven, oriented, so that when we realize all the fanfare, doing it all over again, every semester, decolonizing, dismantling, disrupting, advocating, putting our bodies on the line, that we're doing it for a different purpose. Mine walks in a 4'3" and 5' body of my 2 younger daughters, right? But each of us have a purposeful meaning of why we come into this work and how we do it, and we have to hold on to that.
Thank you. Beautifully answered. Kathryn, we've got about 5 minutes left, but Kathryn, I just want to bring you in really quickly, just for a few minutes into that. I thought you did a really great job at the start of your contribution, and I think with cultural humility, you talked about, as a white woman, not having lived and living experience, but that you had proceeded with this work. We're just saying a lot of the burden falls on minorities, Black academics, Asian academics, and so on. But you, as a white student, took on this work. What's your take on who should do the work? How should we reward people doing for this work? What's your take as a white medical student?
I think it's an interesting question, and it's one I ask myself a lot as well. So I actually attended a student-run medical conference over the weekend, and one of the themes was healthcare inequity. And one of the questions, there was a Black emergency medicine physician who gave a fantastic talk. And one of the questions was, I see a lot of kind of anti-racist agendas or projects such as my own being run by non-BIPOC students or people. And and they were asking her, what is your opinion of this? Like, I think it came across to me as if they felt that that should not be the case, essentially. And she said, you know, I think this is everybody's responsibility. Like, we all need to be advocating for the marginalized and speaking up. And I guess for me, it's something I am very aware of and sometimes a bit apprehensive about, because I don't want to claim to have any knowledge that I don't have or anything like that. But a lot for me, I guess the motivation for the project in the first place stemmed from ongoing conversations with my peers in class. And it's like, the second you hear that, you're like, well, you know, I'm a scientist by training. You're trained to question everything all the time. And you kind of think, how are we not questioning all of this? Like, this is ridiculous. So absolutely, I think when the university gives students the opportunity to step in and do something about it, I kind of felt like, well, if we've identified this problem, and not to be naive and say that this will be any sort of big solution to it, but let's start somewhere. And, you know, I do feel it's my responsibility to try and propose a change if I can think of them.
Yeah. Great answer. We've got 3 minutes left. We're running out of time. I just want to draw attention to some of the questions and comments in the Q&A section, and just to remind people on the call that we will be going through the questions, and any questions that were unanswered, we're going to be having a couple of video answers, and in some way we're going to get the recording up, and you'll be able to access those later if your question hasn't been answered live. Some of the really great questions that have been left unanswered. So somebody has pointed out, carrying on that theme about who should be doing the work, Black academics are systematically being driven out of UK universities due to insurmountable institutional racism. The question there is, what can the academic community do to support them and tackle this trend as part of the decolonizing agenda? Somebody else says, fantastic conversation. It strikes me we need to foster a rebellion. So Paulo Freire's resistance at a pedagogical, practical level. You know, we saw that example from medicine, from Kathryn's work, a practical, pedagogical level. The institution tends to institutionalize unless we foster incredibly critical spaces and safe spaces. And remember, safe spaces need not be uncritical. They can be safe and brave. So unless we foster these spaces and bring in a wide variety of theories, particularly those that shift our conception of the human Anthropocene, surely we need to think about assessment, right? And how it contains student performance, the same as accreditation contains our performance, perhaps, as creative academics. So a brilliant question there. We definitely need a 20-minute podcast to answer that one. A comment here, it is absolutely about power. There is power, support, and feeling, a safety in numbers, somebody says. Somebody talking about the Caribbean and English speaking. The majority of the Caribbean is not English speaking. Scholars seem to reproduce precisely the same intercolonial separation in place when they talk about the Caribbean as the ex-British colonies. Or if you're from Trinidad, all four. Spanish speaking, French speaking, Dutch speaking, and Trinidad and English speaking. Let me see. So yeah, lots of really, I see a great comment here. Massive amen, somebody says, to reviewing the function of rankings. Let's throw it out. It contains us. Certainly nothing that drives creativity and academic discourse. So we've run out of time. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much to our panel, Dr. Kathryn Haley, Dr. Saran Stewart, Dr. Glenn Mitoma, Dr. Hannah Robbins, and our Vice Provost, Michael Bradford. I've really enjoyed our conversations. What an amazing audience, some great questions. A reminder, we'll be picking up your questions offline. So come back, the session has been recorded. So if you go to the link, I'm sure that you'll be able to find the recording and also some of us answering your questions afterwards. Thank you so much for your time. Go off and have a lovely afternoon, those of you over in Connecticut, and to those of you over here in the UK, have a lovely evening. Thank you so much for joining the last of this very exciting series. Good night.